this is Judy from Patterns for Pirates, and I'm here showing you how to sew up the gathered sleeve option on the new sweater weather. I've already done one side here for you. So this is a dropped shoulder, which means it goes beyond the shoulder, down the arm a little bit, and then it gets gathered here on this gathered sleeve option, both at the top and again at the bottom. So after we sew our shoulder seams, what we're going to do is gather the top section of our gathered sleeve piece. So here's my gathered sleeve piece. The wider one is the top, and I'm going to open it up. It's on the fold. I like to mark the center, the little notch or pin, and I have my machine on the longest straight stitch possible. 5 stitch length is super common on most sewing machines as the longest straight stitch that you could do, and that's what we call a basting stitch or gathering stitch. Same thing. It's just temporary. In a gathering stitch, you're going to pull the bobbin thread to gather it up. On a basting stitch, it's just there to hold it temporarily in place. So I highly prefer gathering knits and wovens the same way, using 2 gathering stitches, one inside the seam allowance and one outside the seam allowance. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to do about 1/4 inch seam allowance here for my first stitch, which will be inside the seam allowance. I'm just going to go down almost the entire top. I like to leave a little space at the beginning and end. I don't need any gathering in the seam allowance, so I don't put my thread into the seam allowance. So I'm going to stop about 1/2 inch before I hit the edge. I also really like to use a contrasting thread whenever I gather or baste. It helps me not only see it if I need to pull the bobbin thread or pull the basting thread after. I think it's super helpful, and it just takes a few seconds to change your bobbin to something with a contrast. So I have blue in there right now. Again, I don't like to go all the way to the edge at the beginning or the end, or either side, I guess is what it is. So here is my 2 gathering stitches. I did one at 1/4 inch. I did one about 3/4 inch. My seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So my seam will be right in between those 2 stitch lines. It gives you a really nice gather if you do one inside and one outside. And so that's what I recommend. Alright, so here is my front and my back. Here's the shoulder seam, and here's where we're going to attach it. I'm going to try to slip this under my machine to kind of hold it in place for me. I marked the center of my sleeve. The 2 edges right here are not perfectly even. The back is a little bit longer, so I'm going to set my center notch on my sleeve slightly towards the back, and then I'm going to pin both edges to match. I have that 1/2 inch on both sides, so I have the perfect little spot to put my clip as well. Okay. Now, starting at either side, you're going to grab both bobbin threads and very gently tug on them, and it should gather up your sleeve. I like to tug until it's about even. There we go. So it's about even there, maybe a little bit more. And then once it's even, I go ahead and tie my bobbin threads together. And all this does is it helps me not change the length of this while I'm moving the gathering around. So I just tie those together. You can trim it if you'd like. And now I can move these gathers around and try to make them as even as possible. Or if you want more gathering towards the top, or however you like it, really. I usually do it evenly, but you could definitely do more gathers on the very top of the sleeve if you wanted. I'm just going to put a couple clips in here. Go, and I'm just going to repeat on the other side. Oops, and I made it a little too tight. Went a little nuts on gathering, so I just pulled it out a little bit. Now I'm going to tie them off so it doesn't move around. Now I can even out my gathers. Note as well, this is a curved piece, and so you might need to gather the top row or the bottom row unevenly, and that's okay. Being a curved piece, it's a little longer on the top, so you might need to gather this top one a little bit more. Alright, so I'm all gathered up, and now I am going to stitch it with my serger. If you're a beginner, I highly suggest basting this with your machine right at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Even with the 2 rows of gathering stitches, it's just much easier to keep all your gathers perfectly in place and intact on a sewing machine versus serger, unless you have a lot of experience with both gathering, sergers, knits, all of the above. I prefer to sew it with my gathers on top. A lot of people prefer to sew it with their gathers on the bottom, so try out both, see what you like with that. See what you find the easiest. Sewing with a really fluffy sweater knit, so I'm going slow, making sure I'm getting all those little fluffy edges. There we go. Alright, so as you can see, my one stitch line is gone. It was inside the seam allowance, and I do have my second stitch line still there. I like to leave it there through the construction, and I like to take it out when I am completely finished. So now we have both sleeves gathered to the main bodice. What we're going to do is turn our whole bodice right sides together and sew down the arms and down the side seam. This has a side split in it, so I am going to sew the side split really quickly. Alright, so now I'm going to stitch down the side seam. All options on the sweater weather have the side split, so that's something you'll have to do. If you need help with the side split, I also have a video on that section. So I'm going from the wrist all the way down the arm. through the armpit here. And down to the side split. Okay, now that my side seam is done, let's do the bottom of the gathered sleeve. So I'm going to run the same gathering stitches that I did on the top. I'm going to use my longest stitch length, which is 5 on a straight stitch. One thing to note is you want to make sure you have tails on both the bobbin and the top thread. The top thread, you almost always have a tail, but the bobbin, if your machine is like mine and it has an automatic cutter, then you have to pull out the bobbin. So just drop the needle down a stitch, grab the bobbin and pull it out for a little tail. I'm going to start right at the seam now. I don't need to leave a seam allowance, so I'm going to start right at the seam at 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to go all the way around back to the seam. Okay, I'm just going to do the same thing except for at a wider seam allowance. Now I'm going to do it at about 3/4. I just put my foot against that 1/4 inch one and go along, zip along. Okay, now I have my I'll twist it up, my 2 rows of gathering stitches. I have my center marked right here with a notch, and I'm going to grab one of my cuffs and sew it right sides together down the side. Okay, now I'm going to flip it wrong sides together so it looks like a little cuff. I also pre-marked the center of my cuff. Anything that I cut on the fold, I go ahead and cut a little notch. It just always ends up saving me time usually. I'm gonna leave my sleeve inside out, and I'm gonna slip my cuff inside, and I'm just gonna match the seam allowances and put a pin or clip in, and then match my center notches. If you didn't do center notches, you'll just have to find the center on both of these and then match them. I'm going to grab both my bobbins on one side and gather this half of the sleeve to match the cuff. There we go. And just like I did before, I like to gather it to the right length, tie my bobbin threads in a knot, and then move my gathers around until I'm happy. You can put another pin or clip, whatever you prefer, and then just repeat on the other side of your sleeve and cuff. we're having a very rare snow day here in Texas, which is probably what prompted me to pick this super fluffy sweater knit. Uh-oh, I lost a pin in there. It's gonna come out and poke me. There it is. Okay, and again, if you're a beginner with knits, gathering, or your serger, I highly recommend basting here at a 1/2 inch seam allowance before taking it to the serger. If you are super comfortable with knits, gathering, and your serger, then you can just fly into it like me. Again, it really depends on the person, whether they like the gathering on the bottom, gathering on the top. I really don't think either way is much different. So you can try it out both ways, see if you have a preference. I usually do my gathering on the top, but when I do a cuff, so used to doing it like this, I always do. So just like the other one, my first stitch line is inside that seam allowance. My second one is still there. Again, I prefer to leave it till I'm completely done with the construction. I just think it helps hold everything kind of out of the way and in place. But here's what it should look like. Nice gathered sleeve on both sides. And I'll go ahead and remove that basting stitch so we can see the final product. I love the contrasting thread here. Makes it super easy to find and pull out. Especially with something like a sweater knit where you really don't want to grab the wrong thread and accidentally unravel anything. Okay, and let's do this upper one. Here we go. And on the top, you can just find that thread, and it should be just sitting on top. It should not be sewn in any way. Now that you pulled the bobbin thread. Whew. And you know, I forgot to get this one. There it is. My thread matched so well, it just blended right in. All right, and you're done with your gathered sleeve. This is a super fluffy sweater knit, so it's going to be a little more dramatic, and I thought that would be super fun with this. If you don't want it too dramatic, you want to pick something a little thin, a little drapey, the more thick and stable fabric you choose, the more dramatic this gather is going to be. So have fun. I can't wait to see your sweater weathers. Bye.